So it's been already a whole... Oh my god, it's already been 6 years since the original release of the game that shook the whole industry, Breath of the Wild. By this point, everyone has gotten out their critiques and their impressions and their what-have-yous. But it's also been just long enough, and we're all waiting with bated breath for the sequel, that it's time for retrospecting. It's finally time to take a good look back and figure out which parts of the game might have actually been improved. With a sequel coming out, if we want to actually judge it, we're gonna need a good understanding of which parts of the first game were really good and should be carried forward, and which parts we maybe just put up with because, oh, I don't know, maybe it was the hype, maybe we didn't want to stand apart from the crowd, or maybe we just didn't want to ruin our own experience with this amazing new entry into the franchise. Now, to be clear, this game was an absolute experience. My god, I cannot imagine a single person playing it and not locking themselves indoors for days, maybe weeks at a time until they've had their fill. As you might expect, this can make it very difficult to remember the parts which are actually worthwhile from the parts we tend not to see through the rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia. Now, by this point, you might be thinking, what's the use in us peasant consumers throwing out our assessment of the developer's work, especially in the case of Nintendo? To that I say, who knows? Who knows? Maybe in a century or two, Nintendo will finally get a social media team. Maybe the feedback we've been working so hard to compile could eventually lead to games being tailored for the people who actually play them. Wouldn't that be a nice idea? Now, here's the hypothesis I'm working with. Most of Nintendo sales, trust you me, are actually coming from all the people giving them free publicity, the people who get nostalgic and make free content about all the games they loved as kids. Now, if we get those people to make accurate and objective reviews of Nintendo's products, well, that's gonna start reflecting in the sales figures, don't you think? And even if they don't care, I'm not exactly putting my hope for the next generation in the big N. Rather, I'm putting my hope in the thousands of solo and small team indie development studios who are picking up the slack for all the abandoned franchises and design styles Nintendo pretty much forgot about. I'm expecting some of you out there to doubt the value of input players can offer developers. You know, the people who know their stuff. But trust me, when you've been working on a project for months, sometimes years at a time, you start becoming blind to all the small imperfections you just put up with. And worse yet, you stop being able to see solutions, to see alternative approaches, because you've got a way of doing things, you know it works, and you're afraid anything else is either a waste of time or is going to break everything. It's really one of those, well, I've been using hammers my entire life, might as well try to nail in a screw kind of deals. Now, there's no fear in my mind that Nintendo's gonna start putting out yearly sequels with the same unresolved issues year after year, especially not with their killer franchises like Mario or Metroid. But they do have a very bad tendency to stick to outdated systems that have no place in today's gaming space, and honestly, once you break them down, they probably never had a place to begin with. If anyone's old enough to remember, there was that stupid thing in all their major series where you couldn't look around, you had no camera controls. Now, of course, this made sense on the N64, where you technically didn't have a right stick, and they just kind of signed looking left and right to the D-pad. You tapped the button once, and the camera rotated by a set interval, and it was really annoying. Well, that system carried over into the GameCube and into the Wii. That system even goes as far as Mario Odyssey for God knows what reason. It's almost like all of their first-party games are built on the same 30-year-old engine from back when 3D was first implemented, and they've just been patching that thing over and over instead of getting some new tools. Suffice it to say, Nintendo could use all the advice they can get, and while most of the bottles we sent out on the ocean of the internet they'll probably ignore, you know who won't ignore them? All the millions of fans who remember these games fondly, and all the thousands of single-person or very small team indie studios out there. For people like myself who love these retro-style games, our only hope going forward is this new generation of developers, and we have to put in our best effort to let them know precisely what we think suck about the old games and what would get us as consumers to purchase whatever they're wanting to make. Now, the reason I'm recording this isn't because I want to put out my own retrospective, at least not for a time being. No, it's because I found one out there, and I believe the suggestions inside that videos, the design philosophies. The idea that somehow Nintendo or some other developer who might put out a Zelda like in less than 10 to 15 years from now, and that's going to be the only thing people like me have to play to scratch that Zelda itch. That's an absolute nightmare scenario for me. And this is a franchise I really don't want to see derail, because while lots of games have elements similar or even identical to Zelda, none of them are exactly like it. None of them really give you that feeling. For the past god knows how long, we've been stuck with the same Zelda formula ever since A Link to the Past, with small iterational improvements of course, but it's mostly the same thing. And now with Breath of the Wild, that's a complete departure, and no one's sure, probably not even Nintendo themselves when they set out to develop a sequel, what the next game is gonna be like. Before Breath of the Wild, there were 6 solid years of waiting since the prior main series release, Skyward Sword. We had nothing to go on since all the other games were either spin-offs, remakes, or reimaginings of things that came before. And if they do end up releasing the new one, Tears of the Kingdom, or Tears of the Kingdom, I'm not even sure. If they do end up releasing that in 2023, well, that's just going to confirm that from now on, we've got 6 years of waiting to look forward to between releases. And that means if you don't like a choice they went with in one game, you're not gonna have a lot to do with that franchise for the foreseeable future. It's not like back in the NES and SNES days where they will release a new one like every year, and if you didn't like what they put out, you could expect that maybe the next one is gonna come pretty soon and maybe they'll fix it. And if Nintendo really does decide to hit us with a new Coke style change, we've really got nowhere else to turn to. Sure, there's games like the Metroidvanias and the Dark Souls which have similar level design, and you could look to Darksiders and Okami for the mechanical aspects, but it's really not the same. And you can't expect them to just revert the changes, because 6 years of development and design time, that's a lot of momentum to fight against. I mean, think about it this way. Before Breath of the Wild changed everything, they stuck with the Link to the Past formula for 26 years, and ever since that ball started rolling, it started accumulating garbage along the way. Things like long, unskippable dialogue and cutscenes, overly long tutorials, brain-dead puzzles, lots of useless collectibles which gave you no tangible reward and no fun. And now think about it this way, Breath of the Wild might have started a great new era, but if it takes them 26 years to get through this era and try something new, and right at the beginning, they start picking up very bad habits, they're going to carry those forward for the next I don't know how many years. I might not be alive to catch a new formula refresh if they mess this one up, and I really don't want to be stuck playing spin-offs for the rest of my life. Alright, getting into the meat of what I actually want to talk about today, I find there's 3 kinds of bad gaming takes whenever a new release comes out. There's, of course, the people who are just trying to put out content as fast as possible to chase a trend. Then you've got the entitled series veterans who are going to complain no matter what. Make it too similar to the previous one, they'll say you're lazy. Make it just a little bit different, they're gonna say you've lost your way. Finally, you have the strangest category of them all, the people who are jumping into an unknown franchise or a whole different genre altogether with a storied history which they have no experience in. Now, as much as I know we all love to defend our personal niches of gaming, we've gotta admit, it's not too easy for a newcomer to just pop in at the 3rd, 5th, or hell, even 15th installment of a series. Of course, developers are going to aim for as wide an audience as possible, and they're going to do their darnest to onboard newcomers. They're gonna put in all the easy modes and tutorial tips and beginner missions, but come on, let's be real. Someone who's never even heard of attack combos or delaying your inputs on purpose isn't exactly gonna earn themselves an S rank in even the beginning missions of a Bayonetta or a Devil May Cry game. Now, with Nintendo, it's a little bit of an exception because, of course it is, they're always so special, but they make their games very beginner friendly. Even those games that have a high skill ceiling for like 100% completion, anyone can pick those up and have some fun. It's rather intuitive what you're supposed to do in a Nintendo game. Or at least that is the case until Nintendo finally decides to get in line with everyone else and try their hand at one of the most popular genres people have been playing for the past 20 years or so, and they just pretend it didn't exist until now. And And this, I believe, is at least in part what happened with Breath of the Wild, and maybe the reason behind the take I would like to dismantle today. So, starting off, the arguments I'm against originate from a channel known as Bandit Games, which from what I gather actually took off with their initial impression of Breath of the Wild way back when it actually came out. And I'd like to start by saying I have nothing against this man, no matter how vitriolic my discourse might get later in the script, and I mostly agree with the way he appraises the game, with the things he points out as good and bad. The things I'm actually concerned about are the way he would like to see the issues redressed. Right from the start, all of the nitpicks he points out A+. Those are the things anyone who's played the game for any extended period of time is going to get sick and tired of very rapidly. And our first point of contention, climbing in shrines. You can't do it, even though you can do it anywhere else in the game, and there's no reason given as to why. Now, if you don't know, in Breath of the Wild you can climb on pretty much anything except for shrine walls. It even happened to be one of the main selling points of the game, which is really weird because there's nothing to really indicate these surfaces are special, except maybe for all those nice indentations in the wall where for some reason the Sheikah tribe decided to stick LED strips all across them and provide the perfect purchase for your fingers to dig into and help you climb along. But no, climbing is disabled on shrine walls, not on all shrine structures, mind you. You can still climb on all of the blocks and even some of the physics objects. You can of course make your own cryonis blocks out of water and climb those, but the walls are basically made of Teflon. And you know, it's probably just so you don't break all the shrine puzzles that easily, because you know, every single puzzle can be absolutely destroyed, can be cheesed in this game, but doing it with climbing would be really boring. And no, Nintendo, we're not disappointed about the restriction, we're disappointed about the fact you didn't communicate it at all, like you always do. This incongruency with the rest of the world isn't just bad for player immersion, it's also terrible for their understanding of their controls and their ability set. And as Bandit nicely points out, there are similarly straight or even sloped surfaces scattered throughout the overworld that you can climb all day long, well, except when it's raining. Now, he points out to the sandstone walls around Gerudo Town. I'd say that's not a great example because sandstone is a spongious structure and the shrine walls are supposed to be super smooth. I'd rather point out to the mountain faces which are inclined backwards, or those giant pillars around Hyrule Castle. I'm really disappointed here they didn't just make up a funny explanation for it. I mean, come on Nintendo, you're a Japanese company. Have you not heard of Battle Tendency? Does no one there remember the oil pit? Or it would have been even funnier if they had the walls electrified and Link would just get shocked every time he tried to climb. Going back to the oil idea, it would have really fit in with the whole Magitech aesthetic they've got going on. Think back on the very beginning of the game, or every time you updated your map from one of the towers. The data getting uploaded to your Sheikah slate is actually dripping down from the stalactites, which are coated in this viscous substance. They should have just taken some of that magic lube and applied it to all the walls. The next issue is the one you'll hear people complaining about the most. I have never seen the gaming community come to such a consensus. Of course, the weapon durability system. Here's a hot take of my own. It's definitely not the best system, but it's very well intentioned. It just doesn't get there. For all the people complaining about it, I'm sorry to say, you're complaining about the wrong thing. So, the system we got, which pretty much no one enjoys, is actually an answer, a solution to another problem, which was, how do we give players an incentive to switch playstyles during combat? I mean, we model all these weapons and made animations for them. It'll be a shame if people missed out on all these content. What they were actually going for was for you to gravitate towards new weapons. They wanted you to welcome the opportunity every time your weapon breaks to try out something new. I'm willing to bet the picture they had in mind during the design process was something like a high-tension action movie where the hero just breaks their weapon or runs out of ammo, they just grab the first thing on the table and go all John Wick on their enemy. Problem is, that doesn't really mesh with survival games, with crafting games, with things that give you an inventory. The mistake they made here is that they gave the player plenty of room to just stock up on the same weapon they already got comfortable with, as well as weapons they'll never use. Weapons that are oh so special and they're saving them for a special day, which of course never comes. It's a story as old as time and it happens all the time in video games. The problem here isn't that your weapon breaks, the problem is that you're a freaking hoarder, and it's not even your fault. The game not just allows it, but incentivizes it. And I don't think it's on purpose. Now, according to what he says, Bandit Games knows what's up. He enjoys picking up random weapons at enemy camps, improvising, adapting, making up strategies on the fly. That is the name of the game. That's what was intention. But he's doing that because it's his natural proclivity. He's actually going against the incentive system of the game, and that's a terrible thing, that only players who will actually fight the game system are the players who are getting the experience that was intended by the designers. Now, despite all the mud we love to sling at Breath of the Wild for this, it's far from the worst implementation of this system. I mean, just think back to Dark Souls, everyone's darling, including me. In that game you have plenty of fun weapon types, but you're gonna have to pick one to carry you through the endgame. And to get it that far, you're gonna have to put all of your most precious upgrade materials into it. So if you actually wanna finish the game, you're gonna need to know exactly what you're doing and play it safe from the very start, putting all of your points into one single playstyle. You've got very little room for experimentation and you're actively discouraged from it. Most of the bosses are just stat checks to filter out anyone who's trying to smuggle an incoherent build into the endgame. Aside from that, a lot of the really interesting weapons and spells are actually hidden in the later part of the game, so you're not really gonna be able to play around with them until at least New Game Plus. Skyrim pretty much has the opposite problem, where all of the builds are available to you, it's easy to transition from one to the other, but there's a dominant strategy. Sure, all playstyles are viable, but they either take up physical resources, or they're skill-based, or they're just too slow, so you're just gonna stick with the one that's the least of a headache. But if you're looking for an example of one of these systems done not just right, but absolutely stellar, look no further than one of my favorite things to ever come out, Hades. Full disclaimer, I am a huge fanboy of both Hades and Supergiant, the studio behind it, but I think I speak purely objectively when I say this system is watertight. The incentive structure here is quite ingenious. At the beginning of each round, you're given a choice between all of your weapons, but one of them, one which you haven't used in a while, is going to have a special buff that gives you extra experience. So the thinking goes, if you've been winning the previous rounds, you're going to be hit right in your gamer pride. It's like the game telling you, oh yeah, you sure can beat us with a sword, but can you do it with a spear? And if you've been losing the previous rounds, well, maybe you'll just find your luck with this other weapon. But of course, it doesn't end there. Once you're in the run, you have your weapon of choice, but that's not gonna carry you all the way through to the endgame. You'll have to upgrade it. And this is where the brilliance of Hades' system actually shines. It's this perfect marriage between player choice and roguelike randomness. As you're making your way through the levels, the gods up above are going to be gifting you with some boons. You'll have to choose between which boon you want and between which god's boons you accept. The amazing part is, despite there being a myriad of combinations and synergies, you're never stuck in decision paralysis. Unlike other games where you've got no idea how to build your character and you have to look up guides online and you're still confused about the meta, in Hades, you've always got a set number of choices during each upgrade, usually 3, and you can't go back. There's no downgrading, there's no refusing an upgrade or postponing it until later, and there's absolutely no backtracking. Whenever the game presents you with a choice of rooms to check, once you've picked a room, that's your room. There's no checking the other rooms, there's no backtracking. Once you leave a room, it's locked forever and you can only keep moving forward. The same thing applies to the upgrade system. You pick an upgrade, you're mostly stuck with it. You'll have to make the rest of your build on top of it. And the more amazing part is, every build is viable. Every combination of boons, regardless of which gods you choose, if you choose to specialize in one god, or if you want to go with as many gods simultaneously as you possibly can, you're gonna be able to actually run that. Unlike other inferior roguelites, Binding of Isaac, there's no useless boons, and all of the boons actually synergize with each other if you invest in them long enough. The system is actually even more expanded on because you always get a preview of what the next room is going to contain. You know if it's gonna be an upgrade, or maybe a shop, or a room where you can find some resource, or even you could get 2 upgrades, but you're going to anger one of the gods and they're gonna try to kill you. So you've also got to balance how many upgrades you want versus how many resources you want. You can even sell your upgrades. And there's a very good reason why these are called divine boons rather than just upgrades or perks. When you pick a god's boons, you'll earn favor with them, and they're gonna give you more. Conversely, if you throw away one of your divine boons from a god to replace it with a better one, they're gonna get angry with you. So on one side, you've got a system that's incredibly responsive to your choices and will always provide you with something new to reflect your playstyle. style, but on the other hand, it's never entirely up to you and you'll have to go with the flow and find out new combinations you've never thought about. And let me tell you right now, these upgrades aren't just numeric differences. You're basically playing entirely different games depending on what kind of build you're working with. Now, if that wasn't already more than enough reason for you to finally give those nice little weapons staring back at you from their racks a little chance, check this out. There's rewards for beating the game with different weapons. There's secret dialogue trees that you can get by talking to NPCs while you have a certain weapon chosen, and it turns out each weapon actually has 4 different aspects, 4 different forms, and they play completely differently. So if you didn't enjoy the base form, hey, now you've got options, and those options just quadruple the total amount of combinations you can figure out. Okay, if that doesn't have your mind just buzzing with the possibilities, I don't know what will. You have, in effect, 20 separate weapons. Each of those weapons is fully capable of dealing with any single combat encounter, any configuration of enemies, with only one of its combat functions, because remember, every single weapon has a light, heavy, charge, and dash attacks. Now, add to that the fact that with every single boon you pick up, which happens like every other room, you're going to be modifying the way those weapons function at a basic level, so now you're playing an entirely different game every time you upgrade your weapon. Like with this combination, you're just trying to bunch up all the enemies so you can have effects which jump from one enemy to the other. With this other combination, you're trying to coat the entire arena in one of your status effects, and with this other one, you're trying to deal as much damage as you can as quickly as you can because you cannot take a single hit. Now, if Hades takes the opposite approach of Breath of the Wild, where instead of punishing you for using the same weapon too much, it just makes it very tantalizing to try out different stuff, Transistor is more in line with what Zelda did, where your weapon doesn't break over time, but if you die, you lose one of your 4 core functions, which are very similar to the Hades system of light attack, heavy attack, magic, and special. But the catch with Transistor is, you don't permanently lose your abilities, rather they're on cooldown until you reach the next checkpoint. Imagine if in Dark Souls, when you die to a boss, you have to switch to another weapon until you reach the next bonfire. Hey, now that I think about it, that would actually make for a great Dark Souls mod if the weapons in that game weren't so reliant on the upgrade status. Transistor system is very similar to how the Master Sword already works in Breath of the Wild, where instead of durability running out and causing the weapon to break, it just puts it on recharge mode. And that would have been really great if in Breath of the Wild you got one of each weapon type, but as soon as its battery ran out, you had to switch to one of the others. Unfortunately, when it comes to incentives, Breath of the Wild is pretty much the opposite of Hades. You start the game with pretty much every weapon type at your disposal. All you gotta do is just sneak up to an enemy camp and snatch it while they're sleeping, or just fight them over it. First off, you're gonna find whatever playstyle you're comfortable with. Either you're gonna spin to win, or just spam light attacks, or maybe it's gonna be parries. Then you're gonna open up more room in your weapon inventory, and when your currently equipped item inevitably breaks, you're not gonna have to work with whatever you find lying around, you're gonna switch to one of the 30 duplicates you've been hoarding all this time. And then you start taking down the Divine Beasts and getting your champion's abilities and whatever shortcomings your main weapon might have had, which would have led you to using secondary weapons. Well, now you're not even gonna play the game anymore, you're just gonna let the champion's abilities carry you. What I'm trying to say here is the durability and weapon system in general, it isn't necessarily bad, it's a step in the right direction. The old system it replaces was you just had your sword as your main weapon, and maybe some of the other items had some gimmicks you could use in combat sometimes, but mostly not. They were usually just glorified keys for different puzzles. Now with Breath of the Wild, they give you this array of different weapon types, each with a lot of versatility, but also conforming to the whole light attack, heavy attack throw system, so you can pretty much expect most of what pressing a button will do, but they really didn't stick the landing on the incentives front. You have the option to play the way the game wants you to, but you're not really forced to, and you're kind of pushed the other direction, so you're not gonna engage with the weapon system the way it was intended to, you're just kind of gonna do your own thing. And then when the durability system rears its ugly head and you haven't engaged with the system at all, of course you're gonna feel inconvenienced. You are playing a totally different game. And listen, to be fair, finding an appropriate weapon system under the circumstances of a truly open world where you can go anywhere from the start is very difficult. Take for example the amazing weapon system system of the Devil May Cry and Bayonetta series, where when you equip a new weapon type, it's like you're playing an entirely different game, and the enemies reflect that. Some enemies will be a pain to take down if you're not using the appropriate weapon, which, yes, you can technically take them down with just the guns, but you're gonna have a hell of a time. Now, those systems are really great, but they only work because the games are so linear and all the combat encounters, well, they're designed to take place in a specific order, and the developers know exactly when you're gonna unlock which weapon type. And the same stands true for pretty much every Metroidvania you can think of, and a lot of the RPG-ish shooters, which start you off with the precise weapon you need to finish the mission at the mission's beginning. Now, all that aside, that being said, in his video, Bandit doesn't exactly complain about the durability system. What irks him is actually the weapon drops you get from enemies, because, hey, a modifier here and there isn't gonna change much about a weapon. So why ever bother fighting anything if all combat is the same and the rewards you get aren't exactly rewards, they're just busy work for later, because if you pick up a lot of garbage, you're gonna have to sort that inventory sooner or later. In his view, the thing to make combat more engaging would be more RPG mechanics, specifically an experience system, and this is what's most concerning to me. Now, Breath of the Wild, low-key, does actually have experience points, but it's nothing as numerical as something you might find in Dragon Age. It doesn't ever tell you, but the more you fight and the more loot you pick up, the harder the enemies are gonna be and the more expensive the loot you're gonna keep finding. It's more of a rubber banding system than anything. What the game would like you to focus instead are the spirit orbs, which work pretty similarly to how heart pieces worked in previous Zelda games, except now you can also get stamina. You collect 4 of them, and you get to pick an upgrade. Hooray! Now, if you ask me, as far as progression systems go, that is a lot better than standard experience, because first off, you have to scour the land to find all of them. You can't just sit in one spot and keep farming the same enemies. Secondly, there's a set number. With experience points, you're never really sure how many you're supposed to get. You don't know how many levels the game designers expected you to have. Maybe they made it possible for insane people to go up to level 999, but they didn't really require average players to go above level 40 to beat the final boss. Now, personally, I'm very biased towards the Spirit Orb system, because you know exactly how many there are, and that also tells you what percentage of the maximum stats you can achieve you've reached. With regular RPGs, you'll usually have a number the communities come up with, and they're gonna put it on the wiki, say, oh, in order to beat Gwyn, the final boss of Dark Souls 1, you're supposed to be around level 70. But we're never really sure. Maybe the developers intend us to just go in at level 50 and be a lot better at the core mechanics of the game, rather than make up for it through stats alone. But of course, this system has its shortcomings, specifically for players who really like seeing those damn numbers go up during combat encounters. To them, combat is going to be a lot less meaningful if the way you upgrade your character is by doing basically an Easter egg hunt. Because while a few spirit orbs are indeed attained from dungeons which are technically combat encounters, but it's just like you and one tiny guardian, most of them come from purely puzzle shrines. So if you're not enjoying the combat mechanics just for their own sake, if you're not having fun just figuring out different strategies and seeing all the craziness that can go on in this game through just the physics system alone, well then you might feel very unfulfilled when at the end of an encounter, especially a very tough one, you're not seeing any progress on paper. In fact, the only thing you did was just damage your weapons a little bit. And to make matters worse for Spirit Orbs, there's also the cooking system in Breath of the Wild, where you can create temporary buffs for basically no cost at all, which will bring your total amount of health and stamina to the max or even past that point. So, you know, you're not really required to engage with the Spirit Orb system or with any progression system at all just to have the maximum stats. You're going to do cooking and use food items anyway to heal, so might as well just use those to replace progression. So Bandit's argument can be boiled down to, hey, Breath of the Wild already took a lot of steps into the terrain of traditional RPGs, so instead of half-assing it, why not fully commit to that direction and see what a Breath of the Wild would have looked like if it fully embraced the RPG elements, and who knows, maybe even pull them off better than most AAA games. And this is where I take issue with this whole idea. The whole point of Zelda, when it was initially conceived, was to bring the whole sword and sorcery genre to the masses. This is sort of what Nintendo does. It takes other more complicated genres and adapts it to a more digestible format, adding their trademark polish as the cherry on top. You know, not everyone's going to want to get into XCOM, which, especially on the hard difficulties, is very complex. But they might try out Mario and the Rabbids, even though let's say that wasn't developed by Nintendo, so... Take, for example, the RTS genre. Now, how many people would you say are willing to jump into StarCraft, given the complexity it's known for and the reputation it's built up with such an intense competitive scene? Yeah, it's not a lot, but hey, why not try Pikmin? I mean, it's still set in space technically, but hey, look, you're just gardening, and these aren't your units, they're just your little helper plant buddies. So that's basically what Zelda, or the Hyrule Fantasy, was to sword and sorcery RPGs, or maybe the whole RPG genre in general. During the early days of fantasy games, everyone was basically just trying to copy the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set and translate that into whatever you could display on a screen. It was an effort for fans by the fans. It wasn't expected to jive too well with regular gamers or, God forbid, people who don't play video games. I mean, for many years, there weren't even graphics to these things. Eventually, they worked out a system where you would see these long dungeon corridors when you were literally just dungeon crawling, and then we kinda got to the Final Fantasy-ish stage where you would have turn-based combat. But even then, it was difficult, even for people who knew very well the rule set of the tabletop games, to understand how the developers decided to represent everything or interpret the rules. And then along came Zelda, and they did away with all the complicated stat sheets and calculations and dice rolls. Hit dice? What's that? Here's a bunch of hearts. Long inventory lists with different types of equipment and weapons and skills and key items and consumables. Nah, here's a grid with 2 rows and there's all your items. Armor classes and weapon ratings and positioning and distance. Nah, here's your little dude on a screen. He's got a sword. If the sword touches the bad guy, they take damage. Forget all of your levels and classes and skill trees. If you can see it on the screen, it exists. If not, don't think about it. It had all the flair of a fantasy RPG. You're a little elf boy going on a destined quest with a magic sword and there's dragons, but it was an action game and it was cool and palatable and easy to pick up. There wasn't any of the boring stuff. There's no numbers, no experience, no grinding. Yes, your character technically progresses, but upgrades are just kinda laid along your path. You're gonna either find them, or maybe there's some cool secrets that you can do without. The challenge of growing stronger is rather self-explanatory. I don't have to think about two-handed martial weapons and where to find them and if my character is compatible with them. I just see the cool sword, I climb the waterfall, I beat up the Lionel, and now I have the cool sword and I do more damage. There's also none of that sluggish negative momentum that comes with building up a character for a traditional RPG where, oh, you gotta pick their name and their race and how do they look and what's their equipment, what's their race, are they an elf or an orc or a weird crossbreed? No, you're just Link. And maybe there's an argument to be had that not everyone identifies with a blonde, blue-eyed twink in Peter Pan tights, but I'd rather enjoy the convenience of just hitting start game, making a save file, and I'm in the world. No preamble, no lore, no cutscenes, just dodge the spears and hit the pig guys. Now, that's not to say the Zelda franchise has never dipped its toes into more serious RPG territory, but it never worked out. For example, in Zelda 2, which a lot of people don't like for some reason, I don't know, maybe they haven't played it recently, I really love it. That game's got more traditional progression with experience points and leveling up. You can pick between increasing your health, damage output, or magic, there's spells, and you know there was initially going to be a party system in it until they ran out of time and it got condensed down to just Link turning into a full-on fairy, which, well, let's just say it raises a lot of questions. Okay, maybe this game already raised a bunch of questions with the way you restored your health and mana, but let's try to forget about the granny gum jobs. And hey, if Zelda 2 is too old for you or it's not quite your flavor, well, not a lot of people are going to remember this, but there was a ring equipment system in the Oracle games, which by the way are probably the best portable Zeldas, where you could equip different rings, and they had plus versions and plus 2 versions, and they would change your stats or let you turn into enemies or let you understand different languages. Majora's Mask as well technically has you play as 4 separate classes with completely different abilities, different NPC interactions, and different storylines. And right before Breath of the Wild, Skyward Sword was the Zelda game to make the most strides in the direction of traditional RPG options. Whereas before in Zelda, you could technically upgrade your quiver or bomb bag or wallet or weapons or tunic. Those came as endpoints to side quests, and they were just permanent upgrades. You finish the quest and you've got them forever, you're good. But in Skyward Sword, you could repair and upgrade and switch between different equipment types, and yes, you did have to earn or buy at least the ability to hold more arrows or more bombs, but you had a pouch with a limited number of slots and you had to pick. Do you want more health? Do you want more consumable items? Do you want more rupees? It's up to you. So taking all of that into account, you can't really say Zelda's never tried to go more of an RPG route. It has, but it's not really the direction the series naturally goes to. Because at the end of the day, the core tenet of Zelda is to just have upgrades kind of handed down to you as you progress through the game. And this is really one of the core tenets of this series. It's why a lot of people clone these games together with Metroidvanias and Souls-likes. And honestly, I think the experimentation we've seen this far into a pure RPG direction is as far as Zelda should really go. Because man, I don't want to start up a Zelda game and have to grind points into acrobatics for Link to be able to do a backflip. I feel it's much better to have Link as a well-defined character with a moveset that is ubiquitous and universal across playthroughs, just like for example in Dark Souls, even though yes, there's a lot of customization and you can put points into dex or strength or magic builds, there's things you can always rely on, like items work the same way, your parry, as long as you get the timing right, it doesn't matter what kind of character you have, it will interrupt your enemies and give you an opportunity to strike back. And if you look at the way Nintendo designs their games, this is how they go about things. First they make a character, they make his or her moveset, and they build the world around what the character can do. The alternative is to build a world, make sure or pretend to make sure that all of the obstacles can be interacted with through different options, and then have players make characters which can go with either of the options. This is what turns out the kinds of games that Bandit says he likes, more stat-oriented RPGs. And according to him, those games give you more of a reason to engage with the combat system. It's more fun. In Skyrim, you have incentives to keep going back to the combat system because you'll get better weapons, you'll get materials to craft your own items, and you'll ultimately gain experience points and develop your character into what you picture them as eventually becoming. My rebuttal to that goes something like this. Yes, Skyrim gives you incentives to keep going back to the same combat encounters, to clear all the enemies in a given area, but maybe it shouldn't. Maybe Skyrim shouldn't pad out its bloated, underwhelming gameplay and instead offer you more novel and unique experiences. To me, it looks something like this. In most games, what levels and experience and grinding ultimately end up doing is giving you just some numbers on a screen. You go grind, you level up, and then you can fight the tougher enemies, but it's the exact same gameplay that you've been doing while grinding, just with bigger numbers. You've got bigger numbers, the enemies have bigger numbers, and that's the end of the story. If instead, a leveling system opens up the possibility to attain new abilities, which ultimately will change the way you play the game and interact with the world, then I'm totally for it. But at that point, I would ask, why do we rely on the antiquated experience, purely number system, when we've got such options as tying different abilities to quests? Say for example, in Breath of the Wild, you wanted a skill tree where Link could increase his proficiency with a specific weapon type to deal more damage, or he could open up more moves with that weapon type, or he could just be a jack of all trades and learn a little bit of each weapon. And let's say in order to attain these traits, he has to interact with some instructors fighter characters, but the instructors aren't going to teach him anything unless he brings proof that he is indeed a fighter and loves combat. Now, would you rather Link prove that to beating on the same enemies with the same combos for hours on end so he can fill up an experience bar, or would you like a quest where, let's say, Moblin encampments have a boss type character, maybe an enemy that's a weird variant with a different moveset and different weapons, and if you beat them, you can tear off an insignia which proves that you indeed defeated them. Or maybe there could be weapons that only Lynels possess, and you prove yourself by bringing a huge amount of those weapons to your instructors to show that you beat the Lynels. To me, the former sounds like a way more fun experience, but even then, I'm still not 100% comfortable with the idea of your character having a restricted moveset for most of the game. And I'm even less comfortable with games that completely lock your progress until you reach a certain level, which is the case with even some of my most favorite games like The Witcher 3, where certain enemies, if their level is too high, you can't fight them at all. You don't do any damage, it just gets nerfed. Other games won't even let you start quests until you reach the minimum required level. I'm much more comfortable with something like the original Dark Souls, where you can totally beat the game at level 1, and no, there's no rubber banding. The later enemies don't just do less damage or have less health because you're at level 1, they act the very same way they would as if you were at level 200. And it was rather simple to achieve, just make the mechanics consistent. You can go anywhere in the world you want. Granted, you have the specific key items, your weapons will behave all the same, there's no change in animation or attack speed or range, and most importantly of all, your character moveset stays the exact same. You'll even know if you follow the series, when Dark Souls 2 came out, and still to this day, people are very angry, pretty much everyone who plays the game, because they introduced a set which changes how many iframes your dodge has. And you know, you could have an entire discussion here about how much having a consistent moveset and having enemies always take and deal the same amount of damage improves not just the game's sales, but its lifespan, because it's what basically fuels the speedrunning community. Having consistency both in the way your character acts and knowing that the mind-muscle connections you build up over hours of training are going to be reliable. And I believe this is where the Zelda system, the original one, is so beautiful, because from the very start of the game, when you're plopped into the world, you can do everything combat related you can do later on. You can pick up bombs and throw them, you can throw around sword beams, everything's at your disposal from the very start. And honestly, to me, it seemed like a downgrade in future entries where more and more moves got segregated to meeting specific NPCs who have to teach you the spin dash and the down thrust and the up thrust. It's so much more fun to just have all of your abilities from the very start. Just imagine how boring Breath of the Wild would have been if you didn't get the ability to just dash away from an attack and get a perfect dodge or a perfect parry and enter flurry rush mode from the very start, or you couldn't enter arrow time when you jumped from something until you learned all those abilities from something. Honestly, with a lot of skill trees, what I feel the developers are doing is designing something perfectly balanced, like what you get with the character control in Breath of the Wild, then slowly chipping away at those abilities and spreading them out over different upgrades. So basically the player starts with the minimum of the moves he can do to just get by, and in order to make the game any fun, you have to fully unlock one of the paths. Breath of the Wild actually has the opposite problem, where they try to make quests to improve your runes, but because you already start off with a perfectly balanced loadout, they don't really have much to give you. Like, they give you the camera app, and I don't even remember what else as an upgrade. They actually tell you, one of the NPCs says it himself, he just tells you, we have no idea what to give you now. And those are pretty much the reasons why I consider it's always better in any game to just have no stats and a consistent moveset. This way there's a lot less friction for new players to hop in or veteran players to start up a new playthrough, and there's always something cool to show people who haven't seen the game before. Now, if you're of the same mindset as Bandit Games, there's still a huge problem I haven't answered, and that's that repeat combat encounters are not going to be fun. You are not going to have an incentive to grind, and to that, I say, good. You should be disincentivized from grinding, because the game wasn't designed for it. The way the map of Breath of the Wild is laid out is there's there's just this breadcrumb trail of scattered points of interest of really cool stuff to check out, and you're supposed to hop from one to another, just go where your curiosity takes you with the least amount of impediments throughout, and hopefully you won't land in the same place twice. Hopefully you'll just keep going to find new stuff. Now, you are going to run into combat encounters along the way, because otherwise the game's pace would just be too monotone. They have to spice it up every once in a while, but you're not supposed to stop and engage every single time, especially if not really an obstacle. You can just run around or sneak about. You don't have to clear every single combat encounter every time you come across it. It's the very same thing playing Dark Souls teaches you, where if you try to clear every single enemy from one bonfire to the next every time you're trying to pass through, you're going to go insane. What you realize pretty soon into the game is that when you enter a new area, what you're supposed to do is understand the map, find any secret items you can see, and just keep moving. Now, the Souls series had the benefit of bosses to teach you this mechanic, where you're going to die to them a lot, and sometimes as soon as you enter their arena. So you're going to be going back to the arena many times, and you're going to get fed up with trying to interact with anything along the way. You're going to get into the habit of just making a beeline from your checkpoint to the boss and trying to optimize that path to make it take as little time as possible. Anything that stops you along the way drives you crazy, so you learn to start ignoring enemies. Unfortunately, with Breath of the Wild being an open world game, which autosaves every, I don't know, like 5 steps you take, you don't really get that notion. You'll have to remember here, the core tenet of Zelda has always been exploration, and that very much applies to the combat as well. The combat is never about, oh, look how skilled I am, look at my perfect reflexes, look at my amazing timing. No, it's more about gimmicks. It's about, oh, look at this really cool interaction I can have. Look at the way my whip in Wind Waker lets me steal items off of enemies. Look at the way these really tough dark nuts in armor seem invincible, but once I just roll around them, I can cut off the seams of their armor and they're naked. In Breath of the Wild, you suddenly run into these situations where, oh my god, I'm completely surrounded on all sides, but look, if I just get a little airtime, I can pull out my bow and move around in slow motion, picking everyone off individually. Or, oh look, I don't really have any offensive magic abilities. Most of my runes are just utility based, but I can steal wands from Wizropes and just spam fireballs and thunderbolts everywhere. It's all about the gimmicks. Just look at the bosses. It's not a numbers game, it's not a DPS check, it's all about locate the weak spot, understand how your dungeon item is going to interact with it, do it 3 times, and congratulations, you win, yay, here's a heart container. This is why you also don't get a reward for clearing the entire map of enemies. It's supposed to indicate to you, hey, I'm probably supposed to be doing something else. The enemies keep respawning on every red moon. These encounters were not designed with replayability in mind. They made a bunch of enemy layouts, like here's a bunch of small enemies that come in big groups, here's a bunch of strong enemies, here's a bunch of sneaky guys, here's some Wizropes to throw fireballs at you. You're supposed to see them once, figure out the strategy to get past them, and after that, hey look, you can teleport so you don't have to deal with it again. You've already solved the puzzle of going through those guys, you don't have to do it anymore. Now, one of the points I will absolutely concede regarding this game's combat is that there's a very limited pool of enemies. Seeing how this game is otherwise jam-packed with references to every previous entry in the franchise, with items, people, and places, it's rather disappointing to be seeing the same 4 basic enemy types over and over and be fighting the same boss plus a set piece for the ending. But I'm willing to really cut Nintendo some slack here, because the few enemies they did make, well, their AI is absolutely brilliant. There's so many beautiful little touches. For example, the way the bokoblins have a schedule for what they do when they wake up, how they celebrate, how they go to bed, how they patrol, and how they interact with all the items they can throw on the ground, how they act when they lose their weapon, when you throw them some bait, when you throw them a weapon that's too good and they kick your ass with it, or the Hinox, the way they can rip out trees, and all the mechanics revolving around their eyes. And in case you didn't know, the Stelnox Fox, that's the giant skeleton guy, they can lose their eyes and accidentally pick up one of the giant orbs for your physics puzzles and mess up your whole situation, and you're gonna have to fight them for it. I'm really glad they restricted the enemy pool if it was to achieve this level of AI, but I really feel they could have done without some mobs, like the sand seals, the stone golems, and even Blood Gallon. Honestly, they all really suck and they're not that interesting after you've seen them once. They could have easily just cut those out and put in some more classic enemies. But with all the combat stuff behind us, there are other complaints in this video to address. And one of the most common you'll hear in the entire community are the shrines, or rather the lack of dungeons. Alright, now I would be a complete hypocrite if I supported the complete dismantling of the dungeon system, since I previously mentioned elements which are key to the series' identity I think should stay in these games no matter any other overhauls which they might undergo. But I will say, shrines are a great idea, half-assedly implemented, and a step in the right direction. And I think they would have even worked in Breath of the Wild if they had a lot more room to breed. For example, if all the resources that went into building the Divine Beast, which, come on, they're not that great, were just put into making better shrines. Alright, hear me out on this one. Dungeons have been in decline in this series for a long while now, and that's a very concerning issue since they used to be the core gameplay loop before all of this open world stuff. And if you need proof of this trend, all you have to do is look up Boss Keys by Game Maker's Toolkit, because this mad lad actually went through every single game in the main franchise and cataloged how they designed their dungeons, even going as far as to map the dungeon design to his own diagram system so you can better understand. But if you don't have time for that, and you really should make some, the main takeaway is that dungeon design has become increasingly less open-ended. If you study dungeon trends in the earlier Zelda games, it was all about options. You had plenty of routes you could make. You didn't have to do the dungeons in order, you didn't have to go through every room of a dungeon, you didn't have to get every key or open every door, you could use a key for multiple things or not at all. Missing key items didn't lock you out of completing most dungeons, and in some cases you even had multiple entry points to the same dungeon. As the series progressed, it went into more of a Metroidvania system, where a lot of upgrades were necessary for progressing in the game, but you could fudge the order a little, and with a few exploits you could make for some really interesting routes, especially for speedrunning. Once the series reached its terminal point, let's say someplace around Skyward Sword, it was entirely linear. I mean, they could have even done away with the keys and no one would have even noticed. It was, you do the dungeons in the specific order the game tells you to, after you've done the side quests the game makes you do building up to the dungeon, and you always have to do the rooms in the given order. Every single item became mandatory for progressing through the dungeons as well as through the main story, and don't even think about beating the boss until you've whacked him at least once with the dungeon item. Of course, this new model of dungeon gained a lot in terms of teaming and the resources that went into making each of them feel so unique and tell its own story. Look at the first game, it's the same old brick texture everywhere you look with the same song in every single level, while something like the Snowy Manor in Twilight Princess or the Ancient Cistern in Skyward Sword, I mean, those places have a spirit, an atmosphere of their own, and with the latter you're basically reliving an Eastern religious tale that's pretty popular in Japan. It's really cool. There's just one problem with that. Well, one problem besides the whole, very lazily designed puzzles and architecture. You see, if every single development cycle the dungeons are going to take up more time and resources, you're either gonna get a lot less of them, or the games are gonna take way longer to come out, which is a big problem because the quality of the dungeon's design has still been declining, so players have been paying less attention to every nook and cranny you so meticulously 3D sculpted. So you could clearly see it would make very little sense if it takes you 5 years to come up with a new game, and most of that game is comprised of dungeons, and that's what the players are going to be playing the game for. They're not really gonna spend time talking to every NPC, and if they're going to forget the dungeon as soon as they're done with it, whether it takes them 20 minutes or 40 minutes, well, that's not a great plan. Sure, they're still gonna buy the game, but if they finish it that quickly, it's not really gonna stick in the collective consciousness, and you're not only not going to onboard any new fans, but you're going to bleed current ones. Then along came Breath of the Wild and it tore the entire system to shreds. It took everything that made up a dungeon and just exploded it over an open world map, which of course would have been necessary anyway if they were going to make the map this big, since it wouldn't really have been fun to just have 6 or 8 dungeons and have to run across the entire map to get from one to the other. And with that, Nintendo solved the biggest issues around dungeon design. Now you're no longer reliant on your dungeon items to complete the puzzles. You've got your runes, you have them all from the start, and you can pick the shrines and tick them off the list in any order you'd like. This is also great news for the level designers, because now they don't need one director overseeing a huge interconnected system, which was the old style of Zelda dungeon, but rather you can have lots of smaller designers and developers just trying out their own ideas independently in this very well encapsulated shrine, but using the same recycled modular components that would fit anywhere. If they want to make complex shrine with multiple rooms with one consistent team that runs across all the rooms, or maybe puzzles that require you to make changes in more rooms at the same time, they can do that. If they want just one small gimmicky room, they can do that. If they want to have this thing where you, in order to enter the shrine in the first place, it's a gimmick, like you gotta use this giant snowboulder to break open the doors, you can do that. It's not a huge deal. It's not one of only 8 shrines. It's not one of only 8 dungeons. Also, you can have very difficult shrines now, or very well hidden shrines, because hey, if players miss them, it's fine, they can still finish the game. So, at least on a conceptual level, this new dungeon system, well, everything looks great. Come on, let's take a look. What are we missing from the old Zelda formula? Well, okay, we don't have any keys, but we don't really need them, since now you can do the shrines in any order, and the locked door is you not being able to figure out a puzzle, which honestly is the superior way. We don't have the items because obviously we've got runes, that's fine. All the enemy encounters, they're spread out throughout the world. We've got that covered. All the secret hidden goodies, again, spread out throughout the world. Bosses would be a huge issue, and this is something where they really didn't stick the landing, and I think they should have tried harder with the Divine Beast. But I think really the biggest issue is one that wasn't prevalent with the old dungeons, and that's loading times. Oh yes, people have been complaining. See, with the older dungeon, it wouldn't even be a problem if you had a 5-minute load screen if the dungeon loaded all at once and you spend like almost an hour in there. But now with shrines that you can finish in under a minute, or God knows what speedrunners are doing nowadays, maybe it's sub 20 seconds. But the loading alone takes up at least 20 seconds and it can go upwards of 50. You gotta sit through that reloading screen at least twice, once to go in and again to get out. And remember, before you can get out, you gotta actually talk to the old monk. Yeah, that's not gonna be a great system going forward. And sadly, all the nasty bits are in the implementation. It's not like the game design of the shrines itself is bad. It would work just fine if you didn't have to sit through that loading and you could just not talk to anyone at the end. You could just like hop back out into the overworld. If this is a Switch limitation and it's gonna persist in the sequel, that spells out very bad news. Honestly, all in all, I love these new shrines. I think for the future, this new approach of finish the puzzle however you see fit, however you manage, whether you're bringing items from outside you're not really supposed to, whether you're figuring out the solution the developers had in mind, or a different solution, just using the physics system, or you're just glitching your way through, I think this should stay. It is amazing, it is awesome. But honestly, the new shrine system fell flat on its face in a lot of places, not just to do with implementation, but also to do with the fact that other aspects of the dungeon, the classical Zelda dungeon, which couldn't be reflected in the shrine, they kind of tried to segregate those into the labyrinths and the Divine Beasts, and it ended up feeling more like a chore than anything. But I have one final argument on why this system has the greatest potential, and that is of course the dungeon of Breath of the Wild, Hyrule Castle. Oh yes, just look at this beauty. This is what they should have done all along. Multiple, countless entry points, whether you want to storm the castle up front, or sneak in from the side, or dive in from above. There's gonna be impediments either way, it's just which one seems more fun to you. You just Leroy Jenkins your way in, and once you're in, you've got a bit to climb, and you've got a lot of routes, and it doesn't matter which one you take, and there's plenty of optional puzzles along the way, most of them hidden. There's plenty of secrets, and no one tells you where to go or what to do or how you're supposed to get through. You just figure out on your own, and it's amazing. And aside from that, it fits in with the open world design because first off, it's integrated into the world. Like, there's no big loading screen standing between you and it. You can approach this at any time you want. Literally, after you're done with the tutorial, this is your only quest and it never gets updated. It's just defeat Ganon. Just go through the castle, find Ganon, beat him up. That's the one thing, and that's what they should have done with the rest of this game, because this is what open world games like this are supposed to do with their bosses. These games with resource gathering and choose your own path and everything's open to you, right? It's not Skyrim, it's not you have a linear quest line, the main quest with multiple phases and the world changes and all. No, this is more in the realm of something like Minecraft or Terraria, where you basically choose when to begin the boss encounters. You have to either collect some items and put them together, open some portals, you have to go someplace. And this is very much Ganon's castle, Hyrule Castle. This is very much like Minecraft's Nether. Yes, it's technically always there, available for you, connected to the entire map. It's the very center of the map, but you can see a threshold whenever you get close to it. First off, it's surrounded by guardians who will just laser snipe you from across the field. And secondly, the music changes and swells once you get inside, and they put all these awesome filters and smoke effects on the screen. You know you're in a different place once you start approaching the castle. Even your minimap changes to reflect it. It looks like the way it looks when you're inside a divine beast, only a lot more confusing because this place is a damn labyrinth. I think this is what they should do going forward with their dungeon design. It's perfect. Just imagine, instead of the old system where you've got a bunch of dungeons, you can only finish them in order. Before you enter any one of them, you gotta go to the nearby village and sort out everyone's side quest and get the key, get in the dungeon, get the item, and use the item on everything. Instead of that, just imagine what Zelda would be if you had a series of objectives, 5 objectives, 5 dungeons, and you can do them whenever you want, in any order you want, and however you want. You gotta figure out a way to break in, you gotta figure out a way to get to your objective, whether it's defeating the boss or hey, maybe just taking an item, and you don't even have to touch the boss. If you can sneak your way around and grab the MacGuffin, you can do a pacifist run. That would be amazing. Just think about it. Breaking into fortresses, into prisons, into ancient tombs, and coming out alive. It will also really help the whole resource gathering aspect of the game if you couldn't just hoard everything and stock up on 10 different types of the best weapon, and you would be, the longer you would stay in the dungeons, the longer you would be running low on your resources, and you wouldn't have the advantage of just, going back to a safe spot 5 steps behind you and farming things you need to survive. You would be desperate to find any secret chest that could give you some vitals to keep on going. No teleportation, and if you run out of stuff, well, tough luck. Get your tail behind your legs, get back to the entrance, go stock up on items and come back, try again. And it hurts to know they actually did this with the Trials of the Sword, and they didn't do something like that instead of the Divine Beast. Seriously, just take the same system except make the rooms interconnected and make the architecture make sense, make some puzzles that have you going from room to room and picking up on clues or, flipping different levers, make it a little bit more forgiving so your average player can get through, and wham bam, you got yourself the best Zelda dungeons ever. But at the end of the day, dungeons are only half of a Zelda game. And even in the older games where you didn't have much to interact with, you gotta admit, the world, even when it wasn't open, was a huge part of the entire experience. It really teleported you to an entirely different place. And a very good place at that. I believe the only reason I got into the series and stuck with all of the entries is because, well, it's the only fantasy setting which, to me, doesn't feel generic. And this is where we land on another big complaint, and that is that Hyrule is empty. Now, there's 2 very good reasons for that. One is the real world reason, which is development. This is the first open world Zelda, and it's a ginormous map, and previous Zelda maps didn't really give you much to build on. Like, you usually had 4 small, not even cities, not even villages, like just a couple of houses next to each other they called a town. And the other reason kinda makes sense in the story in that Hyrule has been destroyed. We've only been rebuilding for 100 years. There's not a lot going on right now. So what do you do once you get past all the breadcrumb of points of interest and things constantly vying for your attention and realize, hey, there's almost no one on this entire map aside from enemies and maybe some fish? Well, there's something very important you should know about the design philosophy of Zelda in particular. It's something that appears in very few other titles. Alright, everyone's probably heard the story about how Shigeru Miyamoto used to go spelunking as a kid and it was really fun, and he based a lot of the Zelda games, or the feeling he was trying to invoke with the Zelda games, on the time he spent exploring the surroundings of his childhood home. Alright, everyone probably knows that story by now. But something not everyone's gonna be familiar with is the Japanese concept of mono no aware. I'm probably not even saying that right, so I'm definitely not the best person to explain it to you. Let's just say it has something to do with that feeling of awe you get when observing things which are greater than you or me or all of our stupid daily worries. It's something a young boy lost in a vast system of caves would have definitely felt, and also it's something ever present in all of the Ghibli movies, which, surprise surprise, are the biggest stylistic inspiration to Breath of the Wild. Every time you see a majestic waterfall or a mountain which feels like as much of a person as the villagers living at its foot, every time you see ancient ruins covered in moss or a giant towering statue which makes you wonder what kind of civilizations built it, that's when you should be feeling mono no aware. Breath of the Wild was designed to instill that feeling in you even if you don't have a name for it. Now, it's not for everyone, but if you don't want anything to do with it, great news! You can teleport. If you want to skip past all the negative space on Breath of the Wild's map, ignore all the scenery, great news, you've still got plenty of stuff to experience if you just go to the main quest, finish all the Divine Beast, finish Hyrule Castle, and try to tick as many items of the checklist as you can in the secrets category. 100% completion in this game is a full-time job for at least 2 or 3 months if you ask me. Now, on the topic of reaching completion, how's about we tie this whole video with the last point, and it's the final boss. Or is it? It's the villain, Ganon. He's bad. Not like villain bad, like he sucks in this game. Alright, so as a final boss, there's no denying it, Ganon is absolutely horrible. He's more like a poorly implemented set piece. As a villain in the story, as a character, well, he's not even there. I mean, people aren't even complaining about, oh, how bad Ganon is, look at what he did to this entire place. No, the main concern here is just this calamity thing, which is like this black venereal disease pus which just spurts out of Ganon's corpse or something. It's polluting the whole place, and Link should really put down the Master Sword and find himself one of those Super Mario Sunshine flood things if he can. No, I think the real villain of Breath of the Wild is time, like the concept itself. Think about it. Hyrule fell 100 years back because it had no time to prepare. It got hit with a surprise attack and everyone got wiped out. Link recovers over a century-long nap, but guess what? It's too late. He lost. Aside from Zelda and the lowly scientist, everyone he knew and loved is long gone. There's some old villagers now who kinda think Link reminds them of a hero they knew once when they were kids, and that's about it. Link probably had no idea who they were and wouldn't recognize them anyway, cause they were probably 7. The whole thing about traveling to the future, finding it destroyed, and finally getting the strength to finish the fight, yeah, it's not as sweet of a deal as it was in Ocarina of Time, because there's no actual going back. There's no fixing the timeline. Link has lost. The world he knew is in ruins, and all he can do right now is make up for his past mistake and hope to God he can find some amount of happiness in whatever world gets built over the ruins of the one he failed. Now, I'm not gonna say Wind Waker Ganon wasn't the best Ganon, or that it wouldn't have been nice to have one of those villains around. But those types of complex villains require an actual story, and the story of Breath of the Wild's Hyrule has ended a long time ago. And all we're left with in the aftermath is the existential dread of the one villain none of us will ever defeat: time. Ooh, speaking of, if you haven't been checking the play bar down there, I really do not know how to end a video. So, in summary, all of Breath of the Wild's new ideas are really good, but there were just too many to properly implement all at the same time. Also, do not ever add XP to Zelda, thank you.